Today on the podcast, an introduction to what the podcast and myself are all about, and a story that really hits home. Okay, here we are, podcasting on a plane, episode number 1. Now, this is something I've wanted to do for a long time, and I'm so excited to finally be able to share it with all of you. And you know, it's a bit funny. Just as I hit the record button for the first time right now, I actually got a little bit of mic fright, which is really funny because I've been broadcasting over VHF Airways for over 2 decades live, where I can't edit it. But anyway, this is going to be a lot of fun. So since this is podcast number 1, I wanted to share a bit about me and where I come from. And one of the ways I want to do that is by sharing a little bit of a story. Now, we'll get to that a little bit later, but I think the story is going to strike a nerve with just about all pilots. It sure does with me. And at the end, I'll tell you why. But this story has a great deal to do with why I decided to become a pilot and why I decided to make aviation my career. Now, first off, I'm a pilot. And no matter what I do, that's what I see in the mirror, and that's my lifelong passion. And I decided I wanted to fly when I was about 5, somewhere right after I decided I didn't want to be a race car driver after all. And I probably wasn't going to have a good career as a garbage man either. So I took my first flying lesson when I was 14. I soloed when I was 16. And I started flying in a small mountain town, actually in Colorado, where the field elevation was over 9,000 feet. Our traffic pattern altitude was 10,500. And I had no idea that a Cessna 182 would climb at more than 300 feet a minute ever. You know, if we went much above our traffic pattern altitude, we'd even need oxygen. But learning to fly way up there, surrounded by mountains, was an incredible start. And the lessons that I learned up there have been with me ever since. Now, during my college days, I went to Purdue University, which happens to have a fantastic aviation program that I wholeheartedly recommend. And I flew almost every day there and was lucky enough to instruct in that program too. I majored in aviation technology, and just about all of my college comrades have gone on to do great things in the industry. And hopefully we're going to have a lot of them on the podcast to discuss their stories and share them and connect with all of you. Now, one of the best parts of the Purdue curriculum at the time was the 727 simulators. They had 2 of them. They had a 100, which had the something like 2-axis motion, and then they had a full 200 level C up on the, where it rises up 10 feet in the air and has every axis of motion, just like what you train for, what was the ones that you trained for in the airlines. And depending on which major program you were studying in there, it was a way to get a substantial amount of time. And I was able to accumulate about 30 hours of loggable 727 level C full motion time combined with a full classroom ground school. So as the industry moves on, it's kind of nice to say that we had the opportunity once upon a time to, I guess, just kick it old school. But anyway, I'm a CFI also, and I've given several thousand hours of dual. And yeah, I actually still love to teach. And as a matter of fact, if you want to fly together, you can get in touch with me, and I'd be happy maybe to do your next flight review for you. After college, I did my dues paying and time building in order to secure a job flying a turboprop at a large regional carrier. And no, I'm not going to say which one, but let's say I know the Dash 8 pretty well. The bummer, though, is that shortly into my appointment there, I really had the realization that I drank way too much of the airline Kool-Aid, and I really just took the first job I could get my hands on, which at the time made a little more sense, but the company and I weren't really a good fit, and I decided to move on to something else before it cost me a little more than I was willing to lose in order to stay there. Now, right before the economic crash in 2008, I was also able to have a once-in-a-lifetime gig as a sales rep for an aircraft dealer, and they were affiliated with what's probably the most well-known aircraft manufacturer in the world, and selling airplanes was an incredibly eye-opening experience to the ways of the world, and probably one of the most eye-opening experiences I've actually had in my entire life. And that leads me to what I do now, and I'm an air traffic controller. I work at a control tower, and I work at a busy, predominantly general aviation airport where pilot training is alive and well. And as a current federal employee, and especially a controller, I can't really make the podcast 100% directly about air traffic control, which is actually kind of what I wanted to do at first. But we're going to have a lot of pilot stuff, a fair amount of ATC stuff, so don't worry, and a lot of, we'll call it other. I'm doing air quotes behind the mic here, but other aviation-related stuff. Plus, yeah, I know there is another site out there which has the ATC social media thing kind of on lockdown. So, when you're done listening to this podcast, feel free to go check them out too. Now, as a new entrant into the aviation podcasting scene, I want to take a second to actually thank the other aviation podcasters out there for paving the way and providing great content that I've enjoyed listening to over the years. Particularly Captain Jeff and the Airline Pilot Guy crew. They produce an excellent show every week, and I've always been a huge fan of the Plane Tales segment of their show. Also, Carl Valeri from the Aviation Careers podcast does a great job of coaching people to that dream job. And also on the Stuck Mike Avcast, where they get into general aviation stuff a lot more and flight instruction too. So thanks to all of them for what they do. And if you like what they've got, I'm sure you're going to like what we've got too. So as far as the podcast itself is concerned, I'm not really on a particular schedule. I feel like I'm going to record and release episodes when there's some really good content to share with you, and you probably won't hear from me again until I have some more. So for now, let's just get on with that story I promised you earlier. Now I'm going to read an NTSB report. And this is back when NTSB reports were a little bit shorter, but their goal was the same, to provide the probable cause of an incident. And this one was about actually 5 pages long, but I'll just read you the kind of the meat of what it says. So here we go. The accident flight occurred on May 19th, 1990 at approximately 4 o'clock p.m. Mountain Time. It was a Cessna 210. This was in Telluride, Colorado. TEX is the identifier. The reg number of the aircraft was November 2403 Sierra, and the aircraft was substantially damaged. As far as injuries, there were 3 serious, 1 minor, and 2 with none. It was a Part 91 general aviation flight. The narrative says, after having discussed the local adverse wind conditions near the departure into the runway with airport operation personnel, the private pilot elected to attempt the flight. He said that during his takeoff climb, he unexpectedly encountered a very strong downdraft. In an attempt to maintain altitude, the aircraft stalled and it collided with the ground. Despite warning from airport personnel, the pilot stated before the flight that he should attempt to climb over adverse winds rather than maintaining additional airspeed. The aircraft was very near maximum gross weight, and the pilot used 20 degrees of flaps instead of the recommended 10. The pilot was aware of a booklet at the airport that warned of hazardous wind conditions, especially when winds were southerly in excess of 10 miles per hour. The density altitude was 10,760 feet. The NTSB's probable cause and findings are the pilot's failure to maintain flying speed, which resulted in a stall. An additional factor was wind shear reported off the departure end of the runway. Now, at the beginning of the podcast, I mentioned that this was a story that really hits home. And why is that? Well, one of those uninjured lucky people was me. And even as a 9-year-old kid, I knew we were going to crash during this whole incident. I already spent so much time studying airplanes and how they flew and playing with model airplanes and painstakingly gluing them together. And I remember the whole thing just like it was yesterday. I thought, this guy's going to crash this plane. And as we hit the ground, all I could think of was, I told you so. And at the time, I didn't know what a stall warning horn was, but I knew enough to know that that horn blaring in the background was a bad sound to be hearing continuously on our takeoff. And what the NTSB didn't include in their report, of course, was that the stall that crashed the plane, we now widely refer to as a secondary stall. And it occurred due to the poor recovery technique from the first one, which shouldn't have happened. And it was compounded, of course, by the inappropriate flap setting. And in the immediate aftermath, after the crash, I remember coming to, I was hanging upside down by my seatbelt. And right in front of my face was a broken piece of glass. And as I hung there, I was able to put together that it was the rear window of the Cessna 210. And through the broken piece of glass, just a few inches from my face, I could see some dirt. I could see a smashed piece of grass and a stunned little bug, actually, that was crawling around. And I was able to figure out that I was hanging upside down and buried in luggage from the cargo area that had been thrown forward as the aircraft flipped upside down. And then, of course, the screaming began as the weight of what had happened set in, and we all began trying to escape. The smell of avgas began to permeate the air, and even as a 9-year-old kid, I knew we had to get out fast. I began to feel hands trying to free me from my seatbelt, and as I was released, I did a sort of somersault onto what was the roof of the interior of the plane. And as I turned to crawl out, I could see that it was the wife of the pilot who had been sitting in the co-pilot seat who was pulling me towards safety. The gyros in the late 70s era panel were still whirring away. As I crawled on that roof lining toward the door, I began to slip. And at first I thought it was fuel, but it turns out it was fresh blood. The roof lining and the underside of the wing were covered in a mixture of blood, dirt, and brake fluid from the remains of the landing gear. And as I hurried out the door, sliding everywhere, I was able to see my mother, who had been sitting right in front of me, laying near the runway bleeding, but conscious, and near the pilot, who was bleeding badly from his head. Later, we found out that as the aircraft hit the ground, his head had hit the instrument panel, and he was knocked unconscious briefly. I ran toward my mother and the other passengers who were lying and sitting just adjacent to the runway, and I saw the lone airport firefighter speeding toward us in his truck. He began treating the worst injured, but it appeared that I had escaped without even a bruise. Now, the wreckage was about 1,000 feet from the end of that runway, and had we covered any more distance, the crash would likely have been unsurvivable for any of us. There's a cliff at the end of that runway, which drops about 800 to 1,000 feet down the bottom of a steep canyon, and at the bottom there's nothing but a really rocky river, and all the edges are lined with nothing but pine and aspen trees, and the winds in the canyon were likely twice as bad as the winds at the airport had been above. Now, the recovery period for those who were hurt was a long and painful road, and living through an accident like this at a young age, I was only 9, and experiencing firsthand the recovery process has been a driving force in my aviation career. The idea that it probably won't happen to me just never existed, because it already did. And I made a choice that day that I was going to become an aviator, and that I would find out what went wrong, and that I would do my best to never let something like that ever happen to anybody again. In the years since, I've done my best to make sure that my students have had the best instruction I could possibly give. And now in the age of podcasting, I want to use this platform to spread a positive message about flying and about safety. The people you hear from on this podcast are leaders in aviation and related fields, and through this podcast, I'll be able to sleep a little better each night knowing that their messages will be shared with as many people as possible, because aviation is, without a doubt, one of the coolest things on the planet. But it's hard to enjoy if you aren't safe. So thanks for listening. Stay tuned, because we've got a lot of great stuff coming. All right, guys, thanks for listening to Podcasting on a Plane, and I hope you're enjoying listening as much as I'm enjoying recording them. Now, as far as this podcast, I would love to hear your feedback. This is obviously a work in progress for me, so let's try to keep it constructive. But I want to hear what you guys think, and if you have suggestions for show topics or individuals you'd like me to interview, social media you'd like me to share, let me know. If you want to get in touch, the best way, of course, is to check out our website, which is podcastingonaplane.com, and you'll find links there to all the social media, and you can email me directly. You can also check out our Facebook page at Podcasting on a Plane. If you're liking what you're hearing, the best way, of course, to keep up is to subscribe. And you can do that through iTunes or wherever you get your podcast from. Now, subscriptions and ratings are how iTunes ranks its podcasts, so I ask that you please subscribe and give us a good rating, and that'll help me give you the best content. Well, that's all for now. Thanks again for listening. Your frequency change is approved until next time, and you can report back on this frequency for the next episode. Good day. The Podcasting on a Plane podcast is presented for entertainment purposes only. My comments and those of my guests, the website's content, and any of the social media, etc., are not part of my official responsibility as a controller or an FAA employee. The views and opinions you hear on the podcast are mine and those of my guests, and not necessarily that of the FAA. There is no nexus between Podcasting on a Plane and the FAA. Also, while I am a CFI, I'm not your CFI. Nor am I your mechanic, your doctor, your shrink, or your spouse. This podcast is presented for entertainment, camaraderie, and fun, but is in no way, shape, or form professional advice. It's not legal counsel, and it's definitely not flight instruction. If you are in need of professional advice, get some from somewhere more appropriate than a podcast, no matter how good this one may be.